A storm rolled over Branton, Georgia, like something alive, pressing its dark hands against the windows of every home, every closed shop, and every lonely stretch of road. Rain fell so hard it made the highway shine like black glass. Thunder moved low across the sky, and in the middle of that weather, a silver Cadillac Escalade glided through the town, with its headlights cutting soft white tunnels through the rain. Behind the wheel was a man most people in Branton would never recognize, because men like him did not usually pass through places like this alone, in a sweatshirt, with no escort, no uniform, and no polished nameplate on a desk. His name was General Nathaniel Cross, and by morning the whole country would know what happened to him on that road. A police officer would think he had found an easy target, a quiet black man in an expensive vehicle, a temporary tag in the rear window, a stranger passing through town after midnight. But Officer Tyler Griggs would learn, much too late, that the man he dragged into the rain was not powerless. He was one of the most respected commanders in the United States Air Force, a man trusted inside rooms where national secrets were spoken in low voices. And that night, in the middle of a storm, one cruel traffic stop would open the door to something much bigger than one bad officer. General Cross had left Washington hours earlier, after a classified defense briefing that had stretched long past sunset. The kind of briefing where phones were locked away, doors stayed guarded, and every person in the room understood that the words being spoken could shape the safety of millions. He had listened more than he talked, the way good leaders often do. He had asked a few careful questions, signed the papers placed in front of him, and walked out into the damp evening with the same calm control that had carried him through war rooms, air bases, congressional hearings, and nights when young pilots waited for his orders before entering hostile skies. He was not a loud man. He had never needed to be. His authority lived in the steady way he looked at people, in the silence before he spoke, and in the fact that when he gave an order, people trusted it. But after the briefing, he was not thinking about rank, medals, or military history. He was thinking about his daughter. She had called him 2 days earlier, trying to sound casual, but he could hear the tiredness in her voice. She was grown now, with her own life, her own problems, her own stubborn way of pretending she did not need help. Still, he knew. Fathers know things their children do not say, so he changed his route, carved a few hours out of a crowded schedule, and decided to stop by before returning to base. He did not tell her. He wanted it to be a small surprise. Maybe breakfast together, maybe coffee at her kitchen table, maybe a quiet hour where he could stop being General Cross and just be Dad. He wore a plain dark jacket, jeans, and old driving shoes that had seen too many airport floors. His uniform was folded carefully in a garment bag behind the back seat. His military identification sat in his wallet. A sealed leather case with briefing materials rested under a travel blanket in the cargo area, locked, coded, and untouched. The Escalade was new, a temporary dealer tag taped clearly inside the rear window because the plates had not arrived yet. It was the kind of vehicle that drew attention even when it was parked, and moving through a small town at night, in a storm, it looked almost unreal. The body was silver, polished enough to catch every flash of lightning. Water streamed across the glass. The tires whispered over the soaked road. Branton was the kind of town that looked peaceful from a distance. A white church steeple, a county courthouse with old brick columns, a few diners, gas stations, pawn shops, and empty storefronts with faded signs. People passing through might see it as harmless, sleepy, almost sweet. But every town has another version of itself, the version known by the people who have been stopped on its roads, questioned in its parking lots, and made to feel like passing through was some kind of offense. In Branton, there were drivers who warned their cousins not to speed near the county line, truckers who took other routes after dark, young black men who kept both hands high on the wheel if they saw blue lights, mothers who told their sons to call them before driving through. None of that was written on any welcome sign, but it lived there, quiet and heavy, beneath the rain. Officer Tyler Griggs knew those roads well. He had worked nights in Branton for nearly 9 years, long enough to know which stretches were empty, which cameras did not work, and which supervisors would ask questions only after a complaint became public. He liked the late shift because the town belonged to him after dark. The streets emptied, the radio slowed, the rain kept most people inside. Out there, with his cruiser humming and his badge catching the dashboard light, Griggs felt larger than he was. He had built a reputation inside the department, though nobody said it too loudly. He liked out-of-state plates. He liked rental cars. He liked expensive cars driven by people he decided did not look like they owned them. He called it instinct. Other officers called it being proactive. The people he stopped called it something else. That night, Griggs sat in his cruiser near the edge of town, half hidden beside a closed tire shop, watching the highway through a curtain of rain. His coffee had gone cold. The dispatcher's voice crackled now and then, mostly weather warnings and minor calls. He was bored, irritated, and waiting for something to make the night feel useful. Then the silver Escalade passed beneath the yellow streetlight at the intersection, slow and smooth, too clean for the road, too expensive for the hour. Griggs leaned forward, his eyes narrowed. The vehicle had no plate on the back bumper. Through the storm, he could see the square shape of a temporary tag in the rear window, but he told himself he could not read it. He told himself the tint was too dark. He told himself people hid behind temporary tags all the time. By the time the Escalade cleared the light, Griggs had already created the story in his mind. He pulled out behind it, keeping his headlights low for a moment. General Cross noticed the cruiser immediately. He had spent a lifetime noticing movement behind him, beside him, above him. He checked his speed. Legal. He checked the lane. Clean. He glanced at the rear window where the dealer tag sat flat and visible despite the rain. He did not feel panic. He felt only a mild concern, the quiet awareness that any interaction on a dark road could turn uncertain if the wrong person approached it with the wrong spirit. When the blue lights came on, flashing hard against the wet pavement, Cross exhaled slowly. He turned on his right signal. Then, seeing how narrow the shoulder was and how dark the tree line looked, he activated his hazard lights and eased forward at a careful crawl. A large truck stop glowed just ahead, bright with overhead lights and fuel pumps. It was less than a minute away. Cross chose it on purpose, a public place, cameras, light, room for the officer to stand safely away from traffic. It was the kind of decision a responsible driver makes. It was also the kind of decision Tyler Griggs chose to see as disrespect. Inside the cruiser, Griggs grabbed his radio and spoke with rising excitement. He said the driver was failing to stop. He said the vehicle was possibly fleeing. He said he needed another unit. The words slipped out easily, dressed in official language, already shaping the event into something more dangerous than it was. By the time Cross rolled into the truck stop parking lot and came to a slow stop beneath the white canopy lights, Griggs had turned a simple traffic stop into a threat. Cross parked near the front edge of the lot, away from the pumps. He turned off the engine. He lowered the window halfway. Then he placed both hands clearly on the steering wheel. Rain hammered the roof in a steady roar. The blue lights flashed behind him. Another cruiser swung into the lot seconds later, tires spraying water as it cut across the pavement, and stopped at an angle near the Escalade's front bumper. Cross watched it happen in the side mirror. They were boxing him in. His face did not change, but something inside him settled into a colder place. This was no longer routine. Griggs stepped out first. He did not walk calmly to the window. He came out fast, one hand holding a flashlight, the other already near his gun. The backup officer, younger and wider-eyed, moved toward the passenger side. For a moment, the only sounds were the rain, the engines, and the low electronic pulse of police lights, washing red and blue over the silver paint. Cross kept his hands still. He had trained thousands of people in discipline under pressure. Now he gave that same discipline to himself. "Driver, keep your hands where I can see them," Griggs shouted. "They are visible. Cross said, his voice deep, steady, and calm. Both hands are on the wheel. Griggs shined the flashlight directly into his face. Cross blinked against the glare, but did not move. The light swept over his grey hair, his clean-shaven face, his plain jacket, the dark interior of the vehicle. It paused on his hands, then moved around the cabin, as if searching for a reason to be afraid. "Why didn't you stop when I lit you up?" Griggs demanded. "I slowed down, turned on my hazards, and came here because the shoulder was narrow and the weather is bad," Cross said. "This area is lit. I thought it was safer for both of us." Griggs did not like that answer. It was too calm, too reasonable, too much like a man explaining himself to an equal. He took one step closer, his boots splashing in a shallow puddle. "License and registration, now." "My wallet is in my back pocket," Cross said. "My registration is in the glove compartment. Before I reach for anything, I want to know why I was stopped." The backup officer shifted his weight. He heard nothing aggressive in Cross's voice, but Griggs heard challenge. He heard a man who was supposed to be nervous sounding composed. He heard control, and control from the wrong person always felt like insult to him. "You don't ask the questions," Griggs snapped. "I saw no plate. The temporary tag is in the rear window," Cross replied. "It is clearly displayed." "I couldn't see it. That may be because of the storm," Cross said, "but it is there." The simple truth hung between them, quiet and inconvenient. A gust of wind pushed rain under the truck stop canopy, misting the open window and wetting Cross's sleeve. He did not wipe it away. He kept his hands exactly where they were. Griggs's jaw tightened. "Step out of the vehicle." Cross looked at the gun now resting loose in Griggs's hand, not fully raised but no longer holstered. He looked toward the passenger side and saw the second officer's hand hovering near his own weapon. "Officer, I am willing to cooperate," Cross said carefully, "but I am not going to make sudden movements while weapons are pointed at me. I am asking you to lower your weapon and give clear instructions." That was the moment the air changed. Not loudly, not all at once, but something dark passed across Griggs's face. The rain seemed to grow softer for a second, as if the whole night had leaned in to listen. Griggs stepped closer to the window, close enough for Cross to see the anger in his eyes. "You people always think you can talk your way out of everything," Griggs said, his voice low and ugly. "Around here, you learn your place." The backup officer looked toward him quickly, surprised by the words. Cross stayed still, but his eyes hardened. He had heard polished racism in boardrooms, quiet racism in policy meetings, loud racism from men who thought a badge made them brave. But hearing it here, under the lights, in the rain, with a gun in view, gave it a different weight. It was not just an insult, it was a warning. "My name is Nathaniel Cross," he said. "I am a general in the United States Air Force. My military identification is in my wallet. I am telling you exactly where it is before I move." Griggs let out a short, mocking laugh. "Sure you are. I am not lying to you." "No," Griggs said. "You're trying to play smart." Cross's voice remained even. "I am asking for a supervisor." That request made Griggs flare. His shoulders rose, his face reddened beneath the rainwater running from the brim of his hat. To him, a supervisor meant loss of control, a witness, a record, a chance that someone might tell him to step back. He had no intention of stepping back. "Get out of the car!" Griggs shouted. "I will step out when it is safe to do so," Cross said. "I will not reach for the door while your weapon is out." Griggs moved so fast, even the backup officer seemed startled. His hand shot to his belt, and a small black canister came up into the window space. Cross saw it only for a fraction of a second. Then fire filled his eyes. Pepper spray hit him full in the face, hot and blinding, stealing the air from his lungs. He turned slightly by instinct, coughing hard, hands lifting only halfway before he forced them back into view. The pain was immediate, sharp, and total. His eyes slammed shut, his throat burned. The world disappeared into wet darkness and chemical heat. "Stop resisting," Griggs yelled, though Cross had not moved toward him. "Hands where I can see them." "I can't see," Cross gasped. "I am not resisting." The door was yanked open. Cold rain rushed in. Hands grabbed his jacket and pulled. Cross tried to keep his balance, but his legs hit the running board and slipped on the wet metal. He was dragged out sideways, his body striking the pavement hard enough to send a shock through his shoulder and ribs. Water soaked through his clothes instantly. The pepper spray mixed with rain and ran down his face, burning all over again. He heard voices above him, loud and confused, telling him to roll over, stop moving, give them his hands, stop resisting. But he was already giving them his hands. He had been giving them his hands from the beginning. The backup officer sounded uneasy now. "Tyler, wait. He's not fighting." "Cuff him," Griggs barked. "Now." Steel closed around Cross's wrists, too tight, his chest pressed against the wet pavement. His cheek lay against a shallow stream of rainwater, carrying oil and dirt across the concrete. He could smell gasoline from the pumps, hot rubber from the cruisers, and the sharp chemical burn still crawling through his nose. Somewhere nearby, a truck driver had stopped under the awning and was watching with his mouth slightly open. A cashier stood behind the glass doors of the truck stop, frozen in place. General Nathaniel Cross, a man who had briefed defense officials, commanded airmen, and carried the trust of his country into rooms most citizens would never see, lay handcuffed in the rain, while a small-town officer stood over him, breathing hard. Griggs searched him roughly, still muttering about fleeing, about attitude, about people who thought rules did not apply to them. His hands found the wallet in Cross's back pocket. He opened it with the impatient confidence of a man expecting to prove himself right. For 1 second, nothing happened. Then the sound of the rain seemed to vanish. Griggs stopped moving. Inside the wallet was the military identification card. Clean, official, unmistakable. Nathaniel Elijah Cross, General, United States Air Force. The backup officer leaned closer and saw it too. His face changed first. The color drained from it so quickly he looked ill. He stared down at Cross, then back at Griggs, then at the ID again, as if reading it more times might turn it into something less dangerous. "Tyler," he whispered. "He's telling the truth." Griggs did not answer. His mouth opened slightly, but no words came. The flashlight in his hand trembled. The man on the ground was not a thief, not a liar, not a fleeing suspect, not whatever story he had already started building over the radio. He was a high-ranking Air Force general, injured, sprayed, and handcuffed on camera beneath the bright lights of a truck stop. And somewhere inside Tyler Griggs, underneath the fear and anger, a new understanding began to rise. This was no longer a traffic stop. This was the beginning of an ending. This was the beginning of an ending, though none of the men standing in the rain understood yet how far that ending would reach. Officer Tyler Griggs stared at the military identification card as if it had burned his fingers. The bright truck stop lights made the plastic shine in his hand, and the name on it did not change no matter how long he looked at it. Nathaniel Elijah Cross, General, United States Air Force. The backup officer stepped back from the Escalade with his face pale and his mouth slightly open, suddenly aware of every camera under the canopy, every witness behind the glass, and every second of bodycam footage still recording the wet pavement, the handcuffs, the pepper spray, and the man lying there with his cheek against the concrete. General Cross coughed once, slow and painful, trying to clear the fire from his throat. He did not beg. He did not shout. He simply turned his head enough to speak through the rain and said, "I told you who I was." Those words landed harder than anger ever could have. Griggs swallowed, but his throat had gone dry. A few minutes earlier, he had been the loudest man in the parking lot. Now the storm seemed louder than him. He looked toward the backup officer, hoping for some kind of answer, some quick path back to safety. But the younger man gave him nothing. The younger officer only looked at Cross, then at the cuffs, then at the little red light on his body camera, and something like fear moved across his face. Not fear of the man on the ground, fear of the truth. Griggs bent down and reached for the cuffs with shaking hands. "All right," he muttered. "Let's just calm this down." Cross's voice came low and rough. "Do not touch me again until your supervisor arrives." Griggs froze. For a moment, the old anger flashed in his eyes, but it was weaker now, thin and frightened underneath. He stepped back, gripping the ID card too tightly. The backup officer moved closer to Cross and said quietly, "Sir, I'm going to call medical. I'm also going to request a supervisor." His voice shook, but he said it clearly enough for every microphone to hear. Griggs shot him a hard look. The younger officer ignored it. He keyed his radio and asked for an ambulance, a watch commander, and the shift supervisor at the truck stop immediately. The supervisor arrived 7 minutes later, though to everyone standing there, it felt much longer. Lieutenant Harold Vance stepped out of his cruiser, wearing a rain jacket over his uniform and the stiff expression of a man who had already been told enough to be afraid. He saw the Escalade first. Then he saw the general seated on the wet curb with his hands cuffed behind him, eyes red and streaming from pepper spray, clothes soaked through, one cheek scraped from the fall. He saw the temporary tag sitting exactly where Cross had said it was, taped flat in the rear window, visible beneath the canopy lights. Vance did not need a legal education to understand the problem. He needed only eyes. "Get those cuffs off him," Vance said. Griggs started to move, but Cross turned his head toward the lieutenant. Even blinded and injured, he carried himself with a quiet weight that made the lieutenant stop in place. "I want the names and badge numbers of every officer present," Cross said. "I want your police chief's contact information. I want the incident number. I want confirmation that all bodycam and dashcam footage will be preserved. And I want medical treatment before any further conversation." Vance nodded too quickly. "Of course, sir. Of course. This appears to be a misunderstanding." Cross almost smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "No, Lieutenant. A misunderstanding is when a man takes the wrong umbrella from a restaurant. This was a stop without cause, an escalation without threat, and force without reason." Nobody spoke after that. The handcuffs came off. The marks around Cross's wrists were already swelling. The paramedics arrived and rinsed his eyes while he sat under the truck stop awning, shoulders squared, breathing slowly through the pain. Vance tried to keep his voice soft. He said there was no need for this to become bigger than it was. He said weather made things confusing. He said emotions run high on dark roads. Then, carefully, almost gently, he suggested that if Cross went on his way, the department would not pursue obstruction or failure to yield. The words were dressed like mercy, but Cross knew a threat when he heard one. He turned his burning eyes toward the lieutenant. "Are you telling a United States military officer that your department will invent charges unless he stays quiet?" Vance's face tightened. "That is not what I said." "It is exactly what you said," Cross replied. "And your camera heard it." The lieutenant looked down and suddenly seemed to remember the device on his chest. Cross stood slowly, refusing help until he had to place one hand on the side of the ambulance for balance. He gave his statement in short, clean sentences. He refused to argue. He refused to be comforted by apologies that came only after identification. When the paramedic urged him to go to the hospital, Cross agreed. But before he stepped into the ambulance, he looked once more at Tyler Griggs. The officer stood near his cruiser, soaked, silent, and smaller than he had looked before. Cross said, "You thought I was alone." Then he climbed inside, and the doors closed. By Monday morning, General Cross was not alone at all. He had spent the weekend in a private medical suite, recovering from the chemical burns in his eyes, the bruising across his ribs, and the deep ache in both wrists. His daughter sat beside him for hours, angry in that quiet way that hurt more to watch than tears. He told her he was all right, but she knew better. She had seen him come home from dangerous places with less pain in his face. By dawn, Cross's legal team had filed preservation demands with the town of Branton, the police department, the county, and every business near the truck stop. They demanded full bodycam footage, dashcam footage, radio traffic, dispatch records, personnel complaints, text messages, stop data, towing logs, and any communication about the incident. They did not ask politely. They moved like people who knew exactly where to place pressure. Branton's first response was to hide behind a familiar fog. The police union released a short edited clip by lunch. It showed only a narrow piece of the stop, the part where Cross said he was afraid to step out while weapons were pointed at him. The caption called him non-compliant. Local news repeated the department's version before dinner, saying officers had stopped a suspicious luxury SUV with unclear temporary registration during a storm. They mentioned that the driver identified himself as military, but they did not mention the insult. They did not mention the pepper spray. They did not mention the tag was visible. They did not mention the threat from the supervisor. For one brief evening, Branton believed it might survive the way it had survived before, by telling the first story loudly enough that the truth sounded late. Then Cross released the full video. It aired nationally the next night. Not a rumor, not a statement, not a carefully edited defense, but the whole ugly thing from the first flash of blue lights to the moment Cross was dragged onto the pavement. America watched a calm black man guide his vehicle into a lighted truck stop for safety. America watched him put his hands on the wheel. America heard him explain that his wallet was in his pocket and his military ID was inside. America heard Tyler Griggs tell him that people like him needed to learn their place. Then, America watched the pepper spray hit his face. The country reacted with the kind of silence that comes before thunder. Then came the outrage. Veterans groups spoke first. Civil rights lawyers followed. Military leaders, retired generals, local activists, national anchors, and ordinary people who had been stopped on roads just like that one, all said the same thing in different ways. If this could happen to General Nathaniel Cross, with all his rank, discipline, and power, what had been happening to people with none of those protections? The Air Force issued a public statement condemning the treatment of General Cross and calling for full accountability. The Department of Justice opened a civil rights investigation. The FBI arrived in Branton 2 days later with boxes, warrants, and the patient calm of people who knew locked doors did not stay locked for long. They copied servers. They seized phones. They pulled stop records going back years. At first, Branton officials tried to present Tyler Griggs as one officer who made one poor judgment call in bad weather. But one poor judgment call does not create hundreds of similar complaints. One poor judgment call does not explain why black drivers were searched at several times the rate of white drivers. One poor judgment call does not explain private messages between officers joking about scaring people who drove too nice through the wrong town. Discovery opened the basement door, and everything crawled out. Cross's lawyers found deleted messages from a private group chat, where officers laughed about out-of-state plates, temporary tags, and luxury cars driven by black motorists. They joked about making drivers sweat. They talked about which roads had no cameras. They shared pictures of vehicles they wanted stopped later. They called it fishing. They called it cleaning up the town. They never called it what it was. Then came the money records, tow fees, court costs, civil fines, seizures, storage charges. The town of Branton had built a quiet machine that turned fear into revenue. Drivers paid because fighting would cost more. People signed forms because they were scared. Cars disappeared into lots owned by friends of officials. The mayor called it public safety. The police chief called it strong enforcement. The records called it income. The first officer to cooperate was the younger backup officer from the truck stop. His name was Daniel Reese, and he walked into the federal building with a lawyer, shaking hands, and a face that looked 10 years older than it had during the stop. He told investigators there had been an unofficial quota. He said officers were praised for high-dollar stops. He said Griggs liked to target black drivers in clean cars because he believed they would either be carrying cash or too afraid to complain. Reese admitted he had stayed silent too long. He admitted the department rewarded silence. His statement cracked the wall. Others followed. Tyler Griggs was indicted on federal civil rights charges. The police chief resigned before he could be removed. The mayor was charged with corruption tied to towing contracts and illegal revenue schemes. Several officers were suspended. 2 were arrested. Branton's police department was placed under federal oversight, and for the first time in years, the people who had whispered warnings about those roads watched the town answer in daylight. The lawsuit settled months later, for an amount large enough to make headlines, but Cross did not treat it like a victory lap. He stood before the cameras in a dark suit, his eyes clear, his posture straight, and said the money would fund legal defense for victims of police abuse and racial profiling across small towns where the law often felt too expensive to reach. His daughter stood just behind him, holding back tears, not because he looked broken, but because he did not. He had taken something meant to humiliate him and turned it into protection for strangers he would never meet. Before sentencing, Cross agreed to meet Tyler Griggs face to face. The room was small, plain and quiet. No cameras, no crowd, no flashing lights. Griggs sat across the table in a county-issued jumpsuit, his hair grown uneven, his face hollow from sleepless nights and fear. He looked nothing like the man who had shouted in the rain. He looked like someone waiting for the world to decide what was left of him. When Cross entered, Griggs could not look at him at first. "I was part of a culture," Griggs said finally. His voice was low. "That place made us that way." Cross sat across from him and folded his hands on the table. For a long moment, he said nothing. The silence made Griggs shift in his seat. "No," Cross said. "A culture gave you permission. It did not make the choice for you." Griggs swallowed. "I was trained to be careful." "You were trained to be powerful," Cross said. "You were never trained to be honorable." The words were not shouted. That made them heavier. Griggs looked down at his hands. Cross continued, calm and steady, the same way he had spoken on the roadside before pain filled his eyes. He told Griggs that a badge was not courage, a weapon was not wisdom, fear was not authority. He told him that real authority required discipline, and discipline meant controlling the part of yourself that wanted to dominate another person simply because you could. He told him that justice was not something a man owned because the town gave him a uniform. Justice was something a man served, and if he could not serve it, he had no right to stand beneath its name. Griggs tried to speak again, but nothing useful came out. There was no excuse left that did not sound small in that room. Cross stood, buttoned his jacket, and looked at him one final time. "You thought the storm would hide what you did," he said. "But storms pass." Then he walked out. When General Nathaniel Cross returned to duty, he did not return unchanged. People saw the same posture, the same calm voice, the same careful eyes, but those closest to him noticed the quiet moments. The pause before he stepped into a vehicle at night, the way his hand sometimes flexed near the wrist where the cuffs had cut him, the way he looked at young officers now, not with hatred, but with a measured sadness, as if wondering which of them had been taught power without humanity. Pain had followed him back, but so had purpose. Months later, he visited Branton again, not in secret and not alone. This time the rain was gone. The sky was clear, the road dry, and the truck stop lights looked ordinary in the afternoon sun. A small crowd gathered near the edge of the parking lot, people who had once been too afraid to complain, people who had paid fines they never owed, people who had watched their sons come home shaken from traffic stops that never should have happened. Cross stood before them not as a symbol carved from stone, but as a man who had been hurt and still chosen to stand. He did not give a long speech. He simply said that truth does not need to be loud to survive. It only needs someone willing to carry it into the light. He spoke of evidence, courage, and the duty to protect people who cannot protect themselves. And when he finished, no one cheered at first. They just stood there quietly, feeling the weight of a town that had finally been forced to look at itself. Later, As the sun lowered over the Georgia trees, Cross walked back to his silver Escalade. The temporary tag was gone now, replaced by permanent plates. His daughter waited near the passenger door, smiling softly, the kind of smile that carried worry and pride at the same time. Cross looked once toward the road, where the blue lights had appeared that night. He remembered the rain, the burn in his eyes, the cold pavement, the voice telling him to learn his place. Then he opened the door and stood for a moment beneath the fading sky. General Nathaniel Cross had learned long ago that some battles begin with strategy, maps, and orders. Others begin with a lonely road, a storm, and one man refusing to be made small. What happened in Branton was meant to disappear into paperwork and fear. Instead, it exposed a machine that had fed on silence for years. It proved that power without justice is only intimidation wearing a uniform. And it proved that one person, armed with truth, patience, and the courage to stand firm, can make an entire corrupt system answer for what it tried to bury. Cross drove away as evening settled over the town, not healed completely, but steady. Behind him, Branton was no longer just a place people warned each other about. It was a warning itself, carved into public memory, a reminder that darkness can last a long time, but it is never as strong as the first clear light that finally reaches it.